The blood-soaked coral of Okinawa became the stage for what many historians now call the Typhoon of Steel, perhaps the most ferocious battle of the Pacific War. As American landing craft approached the beaches on April 1, 1945, an eerie silence greeted them. Japanese Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima had made an unprecedented tactical decision. Rather than contest the landing beaches as Japanese forces had done at Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and countless other islands, he ordered his 100,000 defenders to wait in a complex network of caves, tunnels, and fortified positions in the island's southern region. It was a decision that would lead to one of the most grueling campaigns of World War II, where Japanese defenders would face the full technological and numerical might of the American war machine in a battle with no retreat and no surrender. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. The Americans were confused. They had expected another bloody beach landing like Tarawa or Iwo Jima, where thousands would die in the first hours. Instead, they moved inland, virtually unopposed. But Japanese Lieutenant General Ushijima wasn't being merciful. He was being strategic. Having studied previous Pacific battles, he understood that contesting the beaches against overwhelming American naval gunfire and air support was suicide. Instead, he chose to preserve his forces for a protracted defense in terrain that favored his outnumbered troops. His 32nd Army would make the Americans pay for every inch of Okinawan soil. Okinawa wasn't just another island in the Pacific Campaign. Lying only 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, it represented the last defensive perimeter protecting the home islands. For the Japanese High Command, its significance couldn't be overstated. It was a crucial testing ground for what would happen if and when the Americans invaded Japan itself. For Okinawan civilians caught between Imperial Japanese defenders and American invaders, it would become a nightmare beyond imagining. The Japanese defense of Okinawa was planned as meticulously as any operation in the Pacific War. General Ushijima and his brilliant chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, had transformed the southern third of the island into a defensive fortress that would make the Americans fight on Japanese terms. They had 8 months to prepare, and they used this time to construct an interlocking network of mutually supporting positions, many built deep into the limestone hills and ridges. Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, Ushijima's operations officer and the primary architect of the defensive strategy, had learned valuable lessons from previous battles. "We cannot stop the Americans from landing," he told his staff officers in a meeting in late 1944. "Their firepower is too great, but we can bleed them in the interior, where their superiority is diminished." This defensive doctrine would become known as the Shuri strategy, named after the ancient capital city of the Ryukyu Kingdom that sat at its center. For the Japanese soldiers preparing these defenses, the work was brutal and unrelenting. Private Takahiko Yamamoto of the 24th Division later recalled, "We dug until our hands bled, then we dug more. During air raids, we dug. During naval bombardment, we dug. At night, we dug." The entire southern part of the island became a warren of tunnels, caves, and bunkers. These were not simple foxholes. The Japanese created an elaborate system spanning over 60 miles of interconnected tunnels, some reaching depths of 140 feet. Entire command centers, barracks, and even field hospitals were constructed underground. Artillery pieces were placed in caves with narrow firing apertures that made them nearly impossible to spot or target. Machine gun positions were sited to create interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that any American advance would face fire from multiple directions. The natural terrain played to the defenders' advantage. The southern region featured a series of steep ridges and draws, with the imposing Shuri Heights at its center. Each ridge became a defensive line that would have to be taken with infantry assaults, neutralizing much of America's advantage in armor and air power. Yahara personally walked every inch of the defensive line, adjusting positions to maximize fields of fire and ensure no approach was left uncovered. Concrete bunkers were reinforced with steel when available, though by 1945, shortages meant many positions relied solely on the natural protection of the island's limestone. Artillery pieces, including deadly 47mm anti-tank guns, were carefully camouflaged and protected by multiple layers of defense. Even the cave entrances were disguised, often appearing as natural features until American troops were within lethal range. The Japanese defenders also implemented an innovative honeycomb defense system. Rather than a continuous front line, they created numerous independent strong points that could support each other without being dependent on any single position. If one was neutralized, the others could continue fighting. This approach would prove maddeningly effective against standard American tactics. For the ordinary Japanese soldier preparing for battle, the outlook was grim. By 1945, most were under no illusions about Japan's strategic position. Private Yoshitsugu Nakamura wrote in his diary on March 20, 1945, "The Americans control the air and sea completely. Supply ships rarely reach us now. We train with wooden rifles and have only limited ammunition for practice. Yet we are told we must hold for at least 3 months, preferably 6. Everyone understands what this means. We are not expected to survive." Most Japanese soldiers on Okinawa had been briefed on what to expect from American tactics. Veterans from earlier campaigns had been distributed among the units to share their experiences. They warned of the devastating naval gunfire, the constant air attacks, and the overwhelming firepower of American infantry. But they also spoke of American vulnerabilities, their reluctance to fight at night, their reliance on established tactics, and their tendency to bunch up when taking fire. Among the defenders were 3 main groups: the regular Japanese 32nd Army units, the conscripted Okinawan Home Guard, Boitai, and naval forces including the Special Naval Landing Forces. For the Okinawan conscripts, the situation was particularly tragic. Considered second-class citizens by mainland Japanese, they were nonetheless expected to fight and die for an empire that had annexed their once independent kingdom only a few generations earlier. The regular army units were mostly veterans, though many of the best Japanese troops had already been lost in earlier campaigns. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in fanatical determination. Imperial indoctrination had been intensified as Japan's war position deteriorated. Soldiers were lectured daily on their sacred duty to die for the emperor rather than surrender. Captain Takeo Shimada told his men, "Each of us must kill 10 Americans before we die. This is the only way we can serve His Majesty now." As preparations continued through the early months of 1945, the Japanese command faced significant logistical challenges. American submarines had effectively cut off the island from regular resupply. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel all had to be carefully rationed. Soldiers' rations were progressively reduced to conserve supplies for the coming battle. By late March 1945, as American ships began to gather offshore, the Japanese defenders watched with a mixture of resignation and resolve. From hidden observation posts, they could see the massive American armada, hundreds of ships stretching to the horizon. The Americans had assembled the largest amphibious force of the Pacific War, the U.S. 10th Army, under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., consisting of 4 Army and 3 Marine divisions, totaling around 180,000 combat troops. On March 26th, American forces seized the Kerama Islands, a small archipelago 15 miles west of Okinawa. This preliminary operation eliminated Japanese suicide boat squadrons and provided a protected anchorage for the invasion fleet. The Japanese defenders on Okinawa could only watch as the noose tightened around them. The pre-invasion bombardment was the heaviest of the Pacific War. For 7 days, American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded the island. Aircraft from multiple carrier groups flew thousands of sorties, dropping bombs and napalm across Japanese positions. From their underground shelters, the Japanese soldiers endured the earth-shaking barrage that seemed to never end. Staff Sergeant Kiyoshi Tanaka later described the experience. The entire world became noise and vibration. Men went mad from the constant bombardment. Some beat their heads against the cave walls until they bled. Others sat rocking back and forth, unable to speak. But most of us simply waited, cleaning our weapons, checking ammunition, preparing for the moment when the Americans would land, and we could at last fight back. Despite the intensity of the bombardment, the Japanese defensive network remained largely intact. The deeply buried command centers continued to function, and most of the artillery positions survived, their guns pulled back into caves until needed. The American planners, unaware of the extent of the Japanese defensive preparations, believed their bombardment had been more effective than it actually was. On the eve of the invasion, General Ushijima addressed his senior officers. "The fate of the empire rests on this battle. We are outnumbered and outgunned, but we have courage and the sacred soil of Japan beneath our feet. We will make the Americans pay such a price that they will abandon their plans to invade our homeland. This is our duty now." Throughout the night of March 31st, Japanese soldiers in their positions received their final orders. Most were told simply to hold their fire until the Americans moved inland, away from the direct support of naval gunfire. Religious ceremonies were conducted in many units. Soldiers wrote final letters home, though few harbored illusions that these would ever be delivered. Small cups of sake were distributed, a final taste of Japan for men who knew they would never see their homeland again. As dawn broke on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, the Japanese defenders watched as thousands of landing craft approached the beaches. The invasion, codenamed Operation Iceberg, had begun. The date was not lost on the Americans, who called it L-Day rather than the more common D-Day. Many wondered if this was to be their last Easter. The Japanese plan called for minimal resistance at the beaches. Only a few artillery pieces fired on the landing craft, then quickly retreated to new positions. Small groups of infantry were positioned as observers to report on American movements, but not to engage in significant combat. This restraint confused the Americans, who proceeded cautiously, suspicious of the apparent lack of opposition. By the end of the first day, more than 50,000 American troops were ashore with minimal casualties. The beachhead was secure, and advance units had moved several miles inland. The Americans began to hope that perhaps the Japanese had abandoned the island or were not prepared to defend it vigorously. This hope was shattered on the second day when advance elements of the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions encountered the first serious resistance. As they approached the town of Yontan, hidden Japanese positions opened fire. The battle for Okinawa had truly begun, and it would quickly become one of the most brutal of the entire war. For the next 2 days, American forces expanded their beachhead and secured the central part of the island, including 2 airfields that would prove crucial for ongoing operations. They encountered sporadic resistance, but nothing like the fanatical defense they had faced on Iwo Jima or Peleliu. Many commanders remained perplexed by the Japanese tactics. On April 4th, the true nature of the Japanese defense began to reveal itself. As American forces pushed south toward the main population centers, they encountered the first of many heavily fortified defensive lines. The initial clash came at Kakuzu Ridge, where the 96th Infantry Division attacked what appeared to be a modestly defended hill. Instead, they ran into a sophisticated network of bunkers, caves, and interlocking fields of fire. The American advance stalled as casualties mounted. Artillery proved largely ineffective against the deeply buried Japanese positions. Tank advances were met with concentrated anti-tank fire from hidden positions. By the end of the day, the 96th Division had suffered hundreds of casualties while making minimal progress. This pattern would repeat itself across the southern front as the American forces encountered what became known as the Makinato Line, the first of several major defensive positions leading to the main Shuri Line. Each approach channeled attacking forces into pre-registered killing zones where Japanese artillery and machine guns could inflict maximum casualties. From their command post deep under Shuri Castle, Generals Ushijima, Cho, and Colonel Yahara monitored the battle's progress. Their strategy was working. The Americans were being drawn into exactly the kind of grinding infantry battle they had planned for. But they also knew that American resources were virtually unlimited, while their own were finite and dwindling. For the Japanese soldier in his bunker or cave, the battle quickly became a nightmare of constant vigilance and sporadic intense combat. During daylight hours, American aircraft and artillery pounded their positions relentlessly. At night, they had to be alert for infiltration attempts or raids by American combat patrols. Sleep came in brief snatches, often interrupted by bombardment or alerts. Corporal Tadao Hayashi of the 62nd Division wrote in his diary on April 8th, "4 days without proper sleep now. We repelled 3 American attacks today. They used the same approach each time. Artillery, then tanks, then infantry. Our anti-tank guns knocked out 2 Sherman tanks at close range. The Americans retreat. Then their artillery pounds us again. We are running low on water. 2 men in our position were wounded, but we have no way to evacuate them to the aid station. The medic says they will probably die." The Japanese had also learned to deal with American tactics. When naval gunfire or airstrikes were called in, they retreated deeper into their caves and tunnels, emerging once the bombardment lifted to reoccupy their positions before American infantry could advance. They became adept at hiding artillery pieces in caves, rolling them out to fire a few rounds, then pulling them back before American counter-battery fire could target them. Night was when the Japanese defenders could be most active. Small infiltration units would slip through American lines to attack command posts, artillery positions, or simply to create confusion and deprive the Americans of sleep. Snipers would move to new positions under cover of darkness, often spending days in the same spot, taking carefully aimed shots at American officers or radio operators before disappearing. One particularly effective tactic was the use of caves and tunnels to move behind American front lines. A position might appear to be neutralized, only to be reoccupied hours later via underground passages. American troops learned to their cost that capturing ground did not necessarily mean securing it. By mid-April, the battle had settled into a grim pattern. American forces would spend days or even weeks reducing a single defensive position, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Japanese defenders would hold until their position became untenable, then fall back to the next prepared line. The advance south measured progress in yards rather than miles. For the Japanese soldier, survival increasingly became a matter of luck as much as skill. Food and water were in short supply. Many positions became isolated as American advances cut them off from the main defensive network. Some units resorted to desperate night raids on American positions, not to inflict casualties, but to obtain water and rations. Medical care was primitive at best. The Japanese had established field hospitals in some of the larger cave complexes, but supplies of medicine, anesthetics, and bandages quickly ran out. Wounded men who might have survived with proper treatment died of infection or blood loss. Those too badly wounded to continue fighting were often given grenades and encouraged to take as many Americans with them as possible in a final act of sacrifice. Despite these horrific conditions, discipline in most Japanese units remained strong. The code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, forbade surrender as the ultimate dishonor. Officers maintained control through a combination of ideological indoctrination and harsh discipline. Soldiers caught contemplating surrender or desertion were summarily executed. By late April, American forces had reached the main Japanese defensive position, the Shuri Line. This formidable network centered on Shuri Castle, the ancient seat of the Ryukyuan monarchy, now transformed into a fortress. The terrain was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare, a series of ridges and draws that channeled any advance into narrow, fire-swept corridors. The battle for the Shuri Line would become one of the most costly of the Pacific War. The Japanese had prepared for this moment, concentrating their remaining artillery and their best troops in this final defensive line. From Chocolate Drop Hill to Conical Hill, from Sugarloaf to Hacksaw Ridge, the names given by American troops to these blood-soaked features would enter military history. For 2 weeks, American forces battered themselves against the Shuri Line with limited success. In the center, the 1st Marine Division fought a desperate battle for Sugarloaf Hill, an unremarkable mound that had been transformed into a fortress. It changed hands 14 times before finally being secured at a cost of thousands of American casualties. On the Japanese side, the toll was even higher. With no possibility of evacuation for the wounded and dwindling supplies, many positions fought until literally the last man. Lieutenant Toshio Okada commanded a company defending a section of Sugarloaf Hill. Of his 140 men, only 8 remained alive by May 18th. His final diary entry read, "The Americans are within 50 meters now. We have 3 grenades and about 200 rounds of ammunition left between us. I can hear them bringing up flamethrowers. We have served His Majesty as best we could. Our only regret is that we could not kill more of the enemy." At the eastern end of the line, the 7th and 96th Infantry Divisions faced similarly fanatical resistance at Conical Hill and Needle Rock. Each position had to be reduced individually, often using flamethrowers, demolition charges, and direct fire from tanks. Even when a position appeared secured, Japanese soldiers would emerge from hidden entrances to attack from behind or infiltrate back into supposedly cleared areas. The weather added to the misery of both sides. Late April brought the start of the spring rains, turning the battlefield into a quagmire. Trenches and foxholes filled with water, the clay soil became a clinging mud that made every movement an exhausting ordeal. For the Japanese defenders, already short on supplies, these conditions brought additional suffering. Trench foot, fungal infections, and dysentery became commonplace as sanitary conditions deteriorated. Inside the Japanese command center beneath Shuri Castle, General Ushijima faced increasingly difficult decisions. By early May, it was clear that the Shuri Line could not be held indefinitely. American pressure was relentless, and Japanese casualties could not be replaced. Yet orders from Imperial headquarters remained unchanged. Hold Okinawa at all costs. There would be no evacuation. Colonel Yahara, the architect of the defensive strategy, advocated for a tactical withdrawal to the Kion Peninsula at the southern tip of the island. This would extend the battle and force the Americans to continue the costly advance. General Cho, more aggressive and traditional in his thinking, argued for a final offensive, a massive counterattack to throw the Americans off balance. After long deliberation, Ushijima sided with Cho. On May 4th-5th, the Japanese launched their largest offensive operation of the campaign. Using their remaining armor and their best infantry units, they struck at the junction between the American Army and Marine units, hoping to split the American line. Initially, the attack achieved surprise, and some Japanese units penetrated over a mile into American positions. But the lack of air support and the overwhelming American artillery quickly turned the tide. By the morning of May 5th, the attack had been contained, and American counterattacks began pushing the exposed Japanese units back. The failed offensive cost the Japanese dearly. Over 6,000 troops were lost, irreplaceable veterans who would have been valuable in the continuing defensive battle. Perhaps more significantly, the offensive consumed much of the remaining artillery ammunition, weakening subsequent defensive capabilities. For the individual Japanese soldier, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Food rations, already meager, were further reduced. Many units were down to one small meal per day, usually a ball of rice, sometimes mixed with grass or leaves to provide some bulk. Water became the most precious commodity, with soldiers risking their lives to collect rain or venture to springs under cover of darkness. The physical condition of the defenders deteriorated rapidly. Private Ichiro Saito wrote in mid-May, "Many men can barely stand due to weakness. Our uniforms are rotting on our bodies. The smell inside the cave is unbearable, a mixture of unwashed bodies, infected wounds, excrement, and death. Yet we continue to fight because there is nothing else for us now." Despite these conditions, the defense remained effective. American advances were measured in yards, and every gain came at a heavy cost. The Japanese had positioned their defenses in depth, meaning that capturing a frontline position only exposed attacking forces to fire from the next line back. Artillery was carefully pre-registered on likely avenues of approach, allowing accurate fire even with minimal spotting. By mid-May, both the Americans and Japanese recognized that the battle had become one of attrition. For the Americans, with their vast resources, this was acceptable if costly. For the Japanese, with no hope of reinforcement or resupply, it meant inevitable defeat. Yet surrender remained unthinkable, both due to the Bushido Code and because of the belief that the Americans would torture and kill prisoners. This belief had been reinforced by imperial propaganda, which portrayed Americans as savage barbarians. Civilians who had been captured earlier in the battle and then returned to Japanese lines, a psychological warfare tactic by the Americans, were often executed as spies, their stories of humane treatment dismissed as enemy propaganda. As the battle for the Shuri Line reached its climax in late May, the rains intensified, turning into a monsoon that lasted for nearly a week. The battlefield became a sea of mud, hampering both attackers and defenders. For the Japanese, the weather provided a brief respite from American air attacks, but made their own living conditions even more miserable. In the final days of May, with American forces on three sides of Shuri Castle and ammunition running critically low, General Ushijima finally made the decision Colonel Yahara had been advocating for weeks. The 32nd Army would abandon the Shuri Line and withdraw to the Kian Peninsula for a final stand. The retreat was conducted with remarkable discipline under almost impossible conditions. Moving at night through torrential rain, using secondary roads and trails, the bulk of the remaining Japanese forces managed to reach the new defensive line. American intelligence failed to detect the withdrawal for nearly 2 days, allowing much of the heavy equipment and command structure to be relocated. For the individual Japanese soldier, the retreat was a nightmare of exhaustion and danger. Units became separated in the darkness and confusion. Some wounded had to be left behind, a heart-wrenching decision for their comrades. American artillery fired blindly into the rainy night, causing casualties among the withdrawing columns. By June 1st, the Japanese had established their final defensive position on the Kian Peninsula, a rugged landscape of coral ridges, caves, and coastal cliffs. They had perhaps 30,000 fighting men remaining, many wounded or ill. Ammunition was critically low, with artillery limited to a few rounds per day. Food was almost non-existent, and clean water was scarce. General Ushijima gathered his senior officers in a cave near the village of Mabuni. His message was direct. "We have fulfilled our duty in delaying the American advance. Our sacrifice has given the homeland precious time to prepare its defenses. Now we will make our final stand. Not one step backward from here. Every Japanese soldier will die in place rather than surrender." As the American forces regrouped and began their advance into the Kian Peninsula, they faced defenders who had nothing left to lose. Japanese soldiers tied themselves to their machine guns so they would die in place rather than retreat. Artillery crews fired their last rounds directly at advancing tanks in suicidal last stands. Officers who had hoarded a few bottles of sake shared them with their men in final ceremonies before battle. The landscape of southern Okinawa itself seemed designed for this last desperate defense. The coastal cliffs provided natural fortifications that could only be approached across open ground. Caves and crevices in the coral limestone offered countless hiding places for snipers and machine gun teams. Even the beaches were defended by sheer cliffs that channeled any landing forces into narrow, easily defended approaches. For the Japanese soldier, the final phase of the battle became an exercise in stoic acceptance of death. With retreat impossible and surrender unthinkable, the only question was how many Americans they could kill before falling themselves. Some units adopted the practice of yokusai, literally shattered jewel, a poetic term for fighting to the last man. Private Takeshi Yamada, one of the few Japanese survivors who later recorded his experiences, described the mindset. "We knew we were already dead. Once you truly accept this, a strange calm comes over you. We didn't speak of tomorrow because there would be no tomorrow. We spoke only of how to make our deaths meaningful by taking as many Americans with us as possible." Despite their desperate situation, the Japanese defenders continued to exact a heavy toll on American forces. The 6th Marine Division suffered some of its worst casualties of the campaign, taking the ridges around Kunashi. The 7th Infantry Division faced similarly fierce resistance at Yaeju Dake. Even with overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air support, the Americans had to fight for every yard. By mid-June, the perimeter had shrunk to a few square miles around the villages of Mabuni and Makabe. Inside this final pocket, conditions for the Japanese defenders had become apocalyptic. Medical supplies were completely exhausted. Many wounded chose suicide rather than burden their comrades. Food had run out entirely, forcing soldiers to subsist on whatever they could forage: grass, roots, snails, even leather from equipment. The civilian population, trapped within the shrinking perimeter, suffered even more terribly. Driven south by the fighting, as many as 100,000 Okinawan civilians were crowded into the Kian Peninsula alongside the military. Japanese propaganda had convinced many that capture by the Americans would result in torture and rape, leading to mass suicides as the American forces approached. For the Japanese officers, the sight of civilians throwing themselves off cliffs or killing their own children rather than face capture was profoundly disturbing, even in the midst of their own desperate battle. Some attempted to provide protection for civilian groups, but with their own forces disintegrating, such efforts were largely futile. As the final perimeter contracted to just a few hundred yards of coastline, General Ushijima and his staff faced their own end. On the night of June 21st, in their command cave near Mabuni, Ushijima and General Cho prepared for death in the traditional manner of samurai. After writing final messages to imperial headquarters and their families, they dressed in formal uniform and shared a last cup of sake. At dawn on June 22nd, as American forces closed in on their position, Ushijima and Cho committed ritual suicide, seppuku, with their adjutants standing by to deliver the coup de grace. Colonel Yahara had been ordered to escape and report on the battle, but few of the senior staff chose this option. Most elected to die alongside their men in the final hours of the battle. For the few remaining Japanese soldiers, the end came in isolated last stands across the southern tip of the island. Some chose suicide, others fought until overwhelmed. A small number, perhaps a few hundred, managed to blend in with civilians or escape into the island's interior, where they continued to hide for months or even years after the battle officially ended. The Battle of Okinawa was declared over on June 22, 1945, though mopping-up operations continued for weeks. For the Japanese defenders, it had been a campaign of unimaginable hardship and sacrifice. Of the approximately 100,000 Japanese troops committed to the island's defense, fewer than 10,000 survived, and most of these were naval or support personnel, not the infantry who had manned the front lines. As an organized fighting force, the 32nd Army had ceased to exist. The impact of the battle extended far beyond Okinawa itself. The ferocity of the Japanese defense and the willingness of both soldiers and civilians to choose death over surrender had a profound effect on American planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. If the battle for a small outlying island had been this costly, what would an invasion of Japan itself entail? This question would never be answered directly, as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought the war to an end without a direct invasion of Japan. But the shadow of Okinawa, the desperate courage of its defenders, and the terrible price paid by all involved loomed large in the final calculations that led to both the use of atomic weapons and Japan's eventual surrender. For those Japanese soldiers who survived, whether as prisoners or the few who evaded capture, the battle left psychological scars that would never fully heal. They had been prepared to die, had seen their comrades fall all around them, and then had to face the unimaginable, life after a battle they never expected to survive. Many struggled with guilt at having lived when so many others perished. Some remained in hiding for years, unable to believe the war had truly ended. The last hours on Okinawa were perhaps the most terrible. As American forces closed in on the final pockets of resistance around Mabuni and Hill 89, the remaining Japanese troops faced their end with a mixture of resignation and desperate courage. Some chose the traditional warrior's death, either through suicide or a final charge against overwhelming odds. Others fought from their positions until overrun, often choosing to detonate grenades rather than be taken prisoner. The American advance through these final positions uncovered scenes of almost unimaginable horror. Cave complexes contained hundreds of dead, both military and civilian, who had chosen suicide over surrender. Makeshift field hospitals were filled with wounded who had been left to die when medical personnel either fled or killed themselves. The stench of death hung over the entire southern peninsula, a grim testament to the battle's ferocity. Yet even in these final desperate hours, the discipline and dedication of the Japanese defenders remained remarkable. Units maintained their positions until physically destroyed. Command structures continued to function even as headquarters were overrun. The code of Bushido, never to surrender, never to shame one's family or country, held firm to the very end. As the sun set on Okinawa on June 22, 1945, the island had been transformed. What had once been a peaceful agricultural community was now a wasteland of blasted coral, burned villages, and hastily dug graves. For the Japanese defenders who had fought and died there, it represented the penultimate sacrifice in a war that was rapidly reaching its apocalyptic conclusion. Their stand on Okinawa had delayed the American advance toward Japan itself, but at a cost that defied calculation, in lives, in suffering, and in the shattered landscape of an island paradise turned battlefield. The tactical retreat to the southern peninsula had been a masterstroke by General Ushijima's staff, extending the battle by nearly a month despite overwhelming American superiority. But for the individual Japanese soldier, it had merely prolonged the inevitable. Trapped with their backs to the sea, with supplies exhausted and reinforcement impossible, they faced their final hours with the stoic fatalism that had characterized the entire Japanese war effort. As night fell on the rugged southern coastline, the few remaining Japanese soldiers prepared for their final dawn. Some wrote last letters, knowing they would never be delivered. Others cleaned their weapons one final time, counting their remaining ammunition, often just a few rounds and perhaps a grenade saved for themselves. Small groups gathered to share memories of home or to sing patriotic songs in quiet voices. For many, it was the first moment of camaraderie they had experienced in weeks of isolated fighting from bunkers and caves. In his final message to Imperial Headquarters, General Ushijima had written, "The 32nd Army fought with pride and died with honor. We did not live to see victory, but neither did we taste the shame of surrender. May our sacrifice not be in vain." Hours later, he and General Cho knelt facing each other in their command cave, removed their uniform jackets, and performed the ritual of seppuku that had been the samurai's privilege for centuries. As American forces prepared for what they expected to be the final push against organized resistance, few understood the true nature of what they faced. They were not fighting merely against an enemy army, but against a philosophical and cultural tradition that made death preferable to surrender. The Japanese defenders of Okinawa did not merely fight until they died, they fought to die, seeing their sacrifice as the fulfillment of their duty to emperor and nation. In the final analysis, the defense of Okinawa represented both the pinnacle and the tragedy of the Japanese military tradition. The tactical brilliance of the defense, the courage of the individual soldiers, and the unflinching discipline under unimaginable hardship demonstrated the finest qualities of that tradition. Yet the refusal to consider surrender, the sacrifice of tens of thousands of lives in a battle that could not be won, and the involvement of civilians in mass suicide represented its darkest aspects. As the battle reached its climax in the third week of June, the Japanese defenders faced not only the advancing Americans, but also the consequences of their own strategic choices. Having drawn the civilian population south with them, they now witnessed the terrible price paid by those civilians, trapped between the American advance and the Japanese defensive positions, with nowhere to flee except into the sea. The final days saw increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers attempting to escape the closing trap, not to save themselves, but because they had been ordered to return to Japan to report on the battle or to prepare for the coming defense of the homeland. Most of these attempts ended in death, either from American patrols or from the treacherous waters of the East China Sea. A few succeeded, making their way to nearby islands or even back to Japan itself, carrying first-hand accounts of the horror they had witnessed. For the vast majority, however, there would be no escape. As dawn broke on June 22nd, the remaining Japanese positions faced the final American assault. Artillery pounded the ridgelines and cave entrances. Naval gunfire struck from offshore. Aircraft dropped bombs and napalm on any visible targets, and through this maelstrom of fire, American infantry advanced yard by yard, eliminating the last pockets of resistance. By midday, organized resistance had largely ceased, though isolated Japanese soldiers continued to fight until they were killed or committed suicide. The 32nd Army, which had entered the battle as one of Japan's premier fighting forces, had effectively ceased to exist. Its men were dead, its equipment destroyed, its positions overrun. But it had achieved its primary objective, to delay the American advance toward Japan itself and to inflict such casualties that American planners would reconsider the planned invasion of the home islands. The cost had been beyond calculation. Of the approximately 100,000 Japanese military personnel on Okinawa, fewer than 10,000 survived as prisoners. Between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians had died, many by suicide after being told that the Americans would torture and kill them. American casualties totaled nearly 50,000, including more than 12,000 killed, making Okinawa one of the bloodiest battles in American military history. In the aftermath of the battle, American intelligence officers interrogated the few Japanese officers who had been captured or who had surrendered after the official end of fighting. They painted a picture of a defense that had been meticulously planned, but ultimately doomed by overwhelming American material superiority. Colonel Yahara, who had been ordered to escape rather than die so that he could report on the battle, provided particularly valuable insights into Japanese thinking. Yahara explained how the decision to defend in depth rather than at the beaches had been controversial within the Japanese high command. Traditional Japanese military doctrine called for meeting the enemy at the water's edge and fighting to the death. The strategy employed on Okinawa, trading space for time and maximizing American casualties, represented a significant departure from this doctrine. He also revealed the extent of the hardships faced by the Japanese defenders. By the final weeks of the battle, most units were operating on starvation rations. Medical care was virtually non-existent, with wounded men often left to die slowly of infection or blood loss. Yet discipline had remained remarkably strong until the very end, with few instances of unauthorized retreat or surrender. For the Americans, the battle for Okinawa provided sobering lessons about what an invasion of Japan itself might entail. If a relatively small island had been defended with such fanatical determination, what would happen when American forces landed on the Japanese home islands, where millions of soldiers and civilians were preparing for a similar defense? These concerns would factor heavily into the decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in August 1945. The prospect of an invasion that might cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese made the terrible destructive power of the atomic bomb seem like the lesser evil to American planners. Okinawa had demonstrated that the Japanese would fight to the death rather than surrender, even in a hopeless situation. For the Japanese military, Okinawa represented both a tactical success and a strategic failure. The defense had been conducted skillfully, inflicting maximum casualties on the attacking forces and extending the battle far longer than American planners had anticipated. Yet ultimately, the island had fallen, and with it, Japan's outer defensive perimeter. The home islands now lay exposed to direct American attack, with Japanese military resources rapidly dwindling. In Tokyo, military leaders studied the reports from Okinawa and drew their own conclusions. Some saw the battle as evidence that a similar defense of the home islands could make invasion so costly that the Americans would eventually accept a negotiated peace. Others recognized that Japan's situation was increasingly hopeless, with American air and naval supremacy making effective defense impossible. This division would continue until the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war in August 1945 finally forced Japan's surrender. The shadow of Okinawa, its terrible cost in lives on both sides, loomed large in these final calculations. For the Okinawan people, the battle had brought unimaginable suffering. Caught between two armies, they had endured bombardment, starvation, and forced participation in the Japanese defense. Many had been driven to suicide by Japanese propaganda that portrayed the Americans as monsters who would rape and torture civilians. Others had been killed by Japanese troops who suspected them of spying for the Americans or who needed their food and shelter. The ancient Ryukyuan culture of Okinawa, with its distinctive language, music, and traditions, had been devastated. Shuri Castle, the historic seat of the Ryukyuan kings and a cultural treasure, had been reduced to rubble. Villages that had stood for centuries were erased from the landscape. Family records, cultural artifacts, and historical documents were destroyed in the fighting. In the weeks following the battle, American forces faced the enormous task of dealing with the human aftermath. Tens of thousands of Japanese and Okinawan bodies had to be buried, often in mass graves due to the tropical heat and risk of disease. Unexploded ordnance littered the island, posing a continuing danger to both military personnel and civilians. The surviving Okinawan population, traumatized, homeless, and often injured, required immediate humanitarian assistance. Perhaps most challenging was the task of dealing with Japanese soldiers who had not surrendered, but who remained in hiding across the island. Some continued to fight, conducting raids on American positions or attacking Okinawans they suspected of collaborating with the occupation forces. Others simply hid, unable to believe that the war had ended or that surrender was permissible. These holdouts would remain a problem for years. The last confirmed Japanese soldier to surrender on Okinawa did so in 1950, nearly 5 years after the official end of the war. Others may have lived in hiding even longer or died in the island's rugged interior without ever being discovered. For those Japanese soldiers who did survive and eventually returned to Japan, the experience of Okinawa left deep psychological scars. Many suffered what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, and severe depression. In a culture that valued stoicism and discouraged discussion of emotional problems, most suffered in silence. Some found it difficult to reintegrate into Japanese society, which was itself traumatized by defeat and occupation. The militaristic values that had been celebrated before and during the war, courage, sacrifice, absolute loyalty to the emperor, were suddenly devalued in occupied Japan. Veterans who had been willing to die for these values found themselves in a transformed society that questioned the very foundations of their worldview. The battle for Okinawa also had profound effects on American military thinking. The high casualties and fierce resistance encountered there contributed to the development of new tactics and technologies designed to overcome similar defenses in future conflicts. The extensive use of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and direct-fire artillery against bunkers and caves on Okinawa would influence American approaches to subsequent conflicts, particularly in Korea and Vietnam. More broadly, the battle highlighted the limitations of conventional military power against an enemy willing to fight to the death from prepared positions. American material superiority in ships, aircraft, artillery, and armor had ultimately prevailed, but at a cost far higher than anticipated. This lesson would resonate through American military thinking for decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Okinawa became a major American military base, a status it retains to this day. The strategic location that had made it so valuable to Japan now made it equally valuable to the United States in the emerging Cold War. For the Okinawan people, this meant that even after Japan regained its sovereignty in 1952, their island remained under American administration until 1972. Today, Okinawa stands as a complex symbol of Japanese sacrifice and American power, of the horrors of modern warfare and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. The Peace Memorial Park in the south of the island commemorates all who died in the battle, regardless of nationality. Its black granite walls are inscribed with the names of over 240,000 people, Japanese, American, Korean, and Okinawan, who lost their lives. For the Japanese defenders of Okinawa, whose story we have followed in this narrative, the battle represented the culmination of their military tradition, both its virtues and its flaws. The courage, discipline, and tactical skill they displayed, often under unimaginable hardship, demonstrated the effectiveness of their training and the depth of their commitment. Yet their refusal to consider surrender, even when defeat was certain, and their involvement of civilians in a hopeless defense revealed the darker aspects of Japanese militarism. In the final analysis, the defense of Okinawa stands as one of history's most remarkable last stands, a battle fought with the knowledge that victory was impossible, but with the determination to make defeat as costly as possible for the enemy. For the individual Japanese soldier in his cave or bunker, facing the overwhelming power of the American military machine, it was a testament to human endurance and the power of training and indoctrination to overcome even the most basic instinct for self-preservation. As we reflect on this battle from the perspective of the present day, it is important to remember that behind the strategic calculations, tactical maneuvers, and casualty statistics were human beings, men who felt fear, pain, hunger, and exhaustion, who missed their homes and families, who wrote poems and kept diaries, even as they prepared to die. The Japanese defenders of Okinawa were products of their time and culture, fighting for what they had been taught to believe was right and honorable. Their story, tragic, brutal, but also marked by extraordinary courage and sacrifice, deserves to be remembered not as a simple tale of fanaticism, but as a complex human drama played out against the backdrop of the largest and most destructive war in human history. In understanding their experience, we gain insight not only into a pivotal battle of World War II, but into the human capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable endurance. The legacy of the battle continues to resonate in modern Japan, where debates about the nation's wartime past remain contentious. For some Japanese, the defense of Okinawa represents the pinnacle of national sacrifice and courage, soldiers fighting to the death rather than surrendering, maintaining discipline and honor, even in the most desperate circumstances. For others, it exemplifies the folly of Japanese militarism, the waste of tens of thousands of lives in a battle that could not be won, and the involvement of civilians in mass suicide. This tension reflects broader questions about Japan's wartime experience and its implications for national identity. Was Japan a victim of militarism, its people led into disaster by a small group of fanatics? Or was there broader complicity in the ideology that led to such desperate last stands as Okinawa? These questions continue to shape Japanese politics, education, and culture. For the United States, Okinawa represents both a costly victory and an ongoing responsibility. The continued American military presence on the island remains controversial, with many Okinawans calling for the reduction or removal of bases that occupy significant portions of the small island's territory. The battle's legacy thus continues to shape not only historical memory but current geopolitics. Perhaps the most important legacy of the battle, however, is its demonstration of the terrible human cost of war, a cost borne not only by the combatants on both sides, but by the civilian population caught between them. The suffering of the Okinawan people, who had little say in the decisions that made their island a battlefield, stands as a powerful reminder of war's impact on those least responsible for it. As the last veterans of the battle pass away, the responsibility for remembering and understanding Okinawa falls to subsequent generations. It is a story that deserves to be told in all its complexity, neither glorifying the violence nor overlooking the courage, neither simplifying the moral questions nor ignoring the human realities. In that spirit, we have attempted to present the experience of the Japanese defenders as they faced the overwhelming power of the American military machine in the spring of 1945. The battle for Okinawa lasted 82 days, from April 1 to June 22, 1945. In that time, it claimed approximately 200,000 lives, including combatants on both sides and Okinawan civilians. It saw some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War, much of it at close quarters in terrain that negated many of America's technological advantages. It featured the last major use of Japanese kamikaze aircraft and the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. But beyond these statistics and superlatives, it was a human experience, a test of endurance, courage, and the limits of human capacity for both suffering and inflicting harm. For the Japanese defenders, it was the culmination of years of training and indoctrination, the ultimate expression of the Bushido Code that valued death over surrender. For the American attackers, it was a grueling ordeal that tested their resolve and resourcefulness against an enemy who seemed to defy normal human limitations. For both sides, it was a preview of what an invasion of Japan itself might entail, a prospect so daunting that it contributed to the American decision to use atomic weapons and to the Japanese decision to surrender after those weapons were employed. In this sense, Okinawa stands as the last major battle of a conventional war, fought on the threshold of the atomic age that would transform warfare and international relations for generations to come. The defense of Okinawa, seen from the Japanese perspective, reveals much about the culture, training, and ideology that shaped the Imperial Japanese military. The willingness to fight to the death rather than surrender, the meticulous preparation of defensive positions, the tactical innovation shown by commanders like Ushijima and Yahara, and the remarkable discipline maintained even under the most adverse conditions all testify to the effectiveness of Japanese military training. Yet the battle also revealed the limitations of Japanese strategy in the face of overwhelming American material superiority. The defense could delay defeat but not prevent it. No amount of courage, sacrifice, or tactical skill could overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Japan's war resources were exhausted while America's seemed limitless. In this sense, Okinawa was both the Japanese military's finest hour and a demonstration of the futility of continued resistance. For the individual Japanese soldier in his bunker or cave, such strategic calculations meant little. His world had narrowed to the immediate tasks of survival and resistance, maintaining his position, conserving ammunition, finding enough food and water to continue fighting. The larger questions of national policy and strategy were beyond his control, or, in many cases, his understanding. He fought because he had been trained to fight, because his comrades depended on him, and because the alternatives, surrender or desertion, were unthinkable in the context of his military culture. The physical conditions these men endured defy modern comprehension. Living for weeks in damp caves or shallow trenches, under constant bombardment, with minimal food and water, surrounded by the dead and dying, they nevertheless maintained their positions and continued to inflict casualties on the attacking Americans. The psychological strain must have been as severe as the physical hardship, knowing that defeat was inevitable, that no reinforcement or relief would come, that death was certain and only its timing and manner remained in question. Yet morale remained remarkably high in most Japanese units until near the very end of the battle. This testifies to the power of the Bushido ethic, the effectiveness of Japanese military discipline, and the genuine belief many soldiers held in the righteousness of their cause. It was only in the final days, as the remaining defenders were compressed into a small pocket on the southern coast, that significant numbers began to surrender, and even then, many chose suicide instead. The defense of Okinawa also reveals the extent to which Japanese strategy had evolved since the early days of the Pacific War. The decision to defend in depth, rather than at the beaches, represented a significant departure from previous doctrine. The sophisticated use of terrain, the integration of artillery and infantry, and the emphasis on making the Americans pay the maximum price for every advance all reflected a realistic assessment of the strategic situation Japan faced by early 1945. Colonel Yahara, the primary architect of the defensive plan, had studied American tactics in previous island battles and designed his approach specifically to counter them. The result was a defense that maximized Japanese strengths, prepared positions, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and soldiers willing to die in place, while minimizing the impact of American advantages in air power, naval gunfire, and armor. This approach came too late to change the outcome of the war, but it did force the Americans to pay a much higher price for victory than they had anticipated. In this limited sense, the defense of Okinawa achieved its objective, to make the prospective invasion of Japan itself appear so costly that alternative strategies might be considered. For the American forces, Okinawa presented challenges unlike any they had faced before. The scale of the Japanese defensive network, the determination of the defenders, and the integration of civilian and military resistance created a battle environment of extraordinary complexity and danger. Standard tactics often proved ineffective against defenders who had no interest in self-preservation and who had prepared their positions with great skill and foresight. The result was a battle of attrition, precisely what the Japanese had planned. American advantages in firepower could destroy individual Japanese positions, but could not overcome the defense as a whole without the commitment of infantry to physically occupy the ground. And it was in close quarters infantry combat that the Japanese defenders could exact the highest price, fighting from positions that had to be reduced one by one, often at the cost of numerous American lives. The battle revealed both the strengths and limitations of American military power in the Pacific War. The material superiority that had enabled a steady advance across the Pacific remained decisive, but its application required greater skill, patience, and sacrifice than in earlier campaigns. The Japanese defenders, though ultimately defeated, had succeeded in making the Americans fight on Japanese terms, a significant achievement given the overall strategic situation. For the Okinawan people, caught between these two determined enemies, the battle brought unimaginable suffering. Their homes became battlegrounds, their villages fortifications, their food and water seized by desperate Japanese troops. Many were conscripted as laborers or auxiliary troops, forced to construct defensive positions or carry supplies under American fire. Others were driven from their homes by the fighting, becoming refugees on their own island. The involvement of Okinawan civilians in the battle, whether as active participants or innocent victims, added another layer of complexity and tragedy to an already brutal conflict. It foreshadowed the total war that an invasion of Japan proper would entail, with the civilian population fully integrated into the defense and subject to all the hardships and dangers of modern combat. In the end, the defense of Okinawa stands as one of history's most remarkable examples of military endurance against overwhelming odds. The Japanese defenders, knowing that defeat was inevitable, nevertheless fought with extraordinary determination and skill, extracting the maximum cost for American victory. Their sacrifice did not change the outcome of the war, but it did influence the manner in which that outcome was achieved. For the men who lived and died in the caves and bunkers of Okinawa, defending their positions to the last round of ammunition or the last grenade, the battle represented the ultimate test of their military training and their personal courage. Few survived to tell their stories, but their experience deserves to be remembered, not to glorify war or to defend the ideology they served, but to understand the human capacity for both inflicting and enduring suffering in the name of duty and belief. The battle for Okinawa began with an eerie silence as American forces landed unopposed on April 1, 1945. It ended 82 days later in a cacophony of artillery, naval gunfire, and the last desperate banzai charges of the remaining Japanese defenders. Between these two moments lay one of the most intense and costly battles of World War II, a struggle that tested the limits of human endurance and revealed both the heights of courage and the depths of suffering that war can produce. For the Japanese defenders, the battle represented both the culmination of their military tradition and its ultimate failure. The courage, discipline, and tactical skill they displayed were products of centuries of samurai heritage and decades of modern military training. Yet these qualities, impressive as they were, could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Japan's war resources were exhausted while America's seemed limitless. The defense of Okinawa, seen from the Japanese perspective, was thus both a tactical success and a strategic failure. It succeeded in inflicting far greater casualties on the attacking Americans than anticipated, in extending the battle far longer than planned, and in demonstrating that an invasion of Japan itself would come at an appalling cost. But it failed in its ultimate objective, to preserve Okinawa as part of Japan's defensive perimeter, and to convince the Americans that the cost of victory was too high to bear. In the larger context of the Pacific War, Okinawa represented the final major battle before the atomic bombings that would bring the conflict to its apocalyptic conclusion. The experience of Okinawa, its terrible cost in lives on both sides, influenced American decisions about how to end the war without a direct invasion of Japan. In this sense, the Japanese defenders achieved a Pyrrhic victory. Their sacrifice helped convince American leaders to seek alternatives to invasion, but those alternatives brought their own form of devastation to the Japanese homeland. For the individual Japanese soldier in his bunker or cave, such strategic calculations meant little in the moment. His world had narrowed to the immediate tasks of survival and resistance. The larger questions of national policy and strategy were beyond his control. He fought because he had been trained to fight, because his comrades depended on him, and because surrender was unthinkable in the context of his military culture. The defense of Okinawa thus stands as both a testament to Japanese military virtues, courage, discipline, tactical skill, and stoic endurance, and a stark illustration of the flaws in Japanese strategy and ideology that led to such a desperate last stand. The willingness to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives in a battle that could not be won reflected a military culture that valued death over surrender and that subordinated individual lives to national objectives in ways that seem alien to modern Western sensibilities. Yet to judge the Japanese defenders by contemporary standards is to miss the context in which they fought and died. They were products of their time and culture, fighting for what they had been taught to believe was right and honorable. Their story, tragic, brutal, but also marked by extraordinary courage and sacrifice, deserves to be remembered not as a simple tale of fanaticism, but as a complex human drama played out against the backdrop of the largest and most destructive war in human history. In understanding their experience, we gain insight not only into a pivotal battle of World War II, but into the human capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable endurance. The defense of Okinawa, with all its complexities and contradictions, stands as one of history's most compelling examples of the lengths to which human beings will go in the name of duty, honor, and national identity, or better or worse. As the last veterans of the battle pass away, the responsibility for remembering and understanding Okinawa falls to subsequent generations. It is a story that deserves to be told in all its complexity, neither glorifying the violence nor overlooking the courage, neither simplifying the moral questions nor ignoring the human realities. In that spirit, we have attempted to present the experience of the Japanese defenders as they faced the overwhelming power of the American military machine in the spring of 1945. The legacy of Okinawa continues to shape our world today. In the American military presence on the island, in Japanese debates about the nation's wartime past, and in broader questions about the nature and cost of modern warfare. As we reflect on this battle from the vantage point of nearly 8 decades, we can appreciate both the tactical brilliance of the defense and the tragic futility of the sacrifice it entailed. For the men who fought and died in the caves and bunkers of Okinawa, defending their positions to the last round of ammunition or the last grenade, the battle represented the ultimate test of their military training and their personal courage. Their experience, the daily reality of combat, deprivation, and impending death, forms the human core of this historical narrative. In remembering their story, we honor not their cause or their ideology, but their humanity in the face of inhuman circumstances. The battle for Okinawa lasted 82 days, from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945. In that time, it claimed approximately 200,000 lives, including combatants on both sides and Okinawan civilians. It saw some of the fiercest fighting of the Pacific War, much of it at close quarters in terrain that negated many of America's technological advantages. It featured the last major use of Japanese kamikaze aircraft and the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. But beyond these statistics and superlatives, it was a human experience, a test of endurance, courage, and the limits of human capacity for both suffering and inflicting harm. For the Japanese defenders, it was the culmination of years of training and indoctrination, the ultimate expression of the Bushido Code that valued death over surrender. For the American attackers, it was a grueling ordeal that tested their resolve and resourcefulness against an enemy who seemed to defy normal human limitations. For both sides, it was a preview of what an invasion of Japan itself might entail, a prospect so daunting that it contributed to the American decision to use atomic weapons and to the Japanese decision to surrender after those weapons were employed. In this sense, Okinawa stands as the last major battle of a conventional war, fought on the threshold of the atomic age that would transform warfare and international relations for generations to come. The defense of Okinawa, seen from the Japanese perspective, reveals much about the culture, training, and ideology that shaped the Imperial Japanese military. The willingness to fight to the death rather than surrender, the meticulous preparation of defensive positions, the tactical innovation shown by commanders like Ushijima and Yahara, and the remarkable discipline maintained even under the most adverse conditions all testify to the effectiveness of Japanese military training. Yet the battle also revealed the limitations of Japanese strategy in the face of overwhelming American material superiority. The defense could delay defeat but not prevent it. No amount of courage, sacrifice, or tactical skill could overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Japan's war resources were exhausted while America's seemed limitless. In this sense, Okinawa was both the Japanese military's finest hour and a demonstration of the futility of continued resistance. As we conclude this narrative of the Japanese defense of Okinawa, it is worth reflecting on the words of Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, one of the few senior Japanese officers to survive the battle. "We fought as best we could with what we had. We knew we could not win, but we believed our sacrifice might save Japan itself from invasion." In that sense, perhaps our defeat served its purpose after all. Whether the defense of Okinawa truly influenced the decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade Japan remains a matter of historical debate, but there is no question that the Japanese defenders achieved their immediate objective to make the conquest of Okinawa so costly that American planners would hesitate before committing to an even larger operation against the Japanese home islands. In the final analysis, the defense of Okinawa stands as one of history's most remarkable last stands, a battle fought with the knowledge that victory was impossible, but with the determination to make defeat as costly as possible for the enemy. For the individual Japanese soldier in his cave or bunker, facing the overwhelming power of the American military machine, it was a testament to human endurance and the power of training and indoctrination to overcome even the most basic instinct for self-preservation.